Hello, my name is Ambra and I am 34. I am the most ordinary woman, although the word ordinary probably doesn't sit well with someone who is ready to dig in the earth for hours as the sun slowly sinks below the horizon. The smell of damp soil, the roughness of clay under my fingernails, the clinking of hose, and the rustling of leaves. All of this is not just a hobby for me, but the very breath of life. I've been obsessed with gardening since childhood. While other girls were having tea parties with their dolls and choosing who would be the prince's wife, I was alone, digging holes in my mom's backyard, planting seeds I found in the kitchen spices, and believing that one day they would sprout into something wonderful. My parents would smile indulgently, sure it was a childish whim that would pass as I grew up. But it didn't pass. When I turned 18, I knew for sure what I wanted: to study landscape design and horticulture. To me, it sounded like a promise of a whole new universe, where one could create beauty out of chaos, turn a wasteland into a blooming paradise. My parents, of course, did not share my enthusiasm. They kept asking if I was sure I didn't want to become a teacher or a nurse, like normal girls. But stubbornness has always been my second skin. I enjoyed every class, even the most boring ones, about soil acidity, root rot, and insect pests. It all seemed part of a great secret knowledge, without which one couldn't become a true creator of the earth. After graduating from university, I worked for several years in landscaping companies, helping to design parks and private gardens. There was a lot of work, and I learned quickly, but somewhere deep down, I constantly felt I was capable of more. My bosses were polite, even friendly, but they lacked the flame that burned inside me. They chased deadlines, used cheap plants on plots to save money. Everything was done mechanically, without a soul. It drove me crazy. When I turned 25, I took a step that seemed insane even to me. I spent all my savings and opened my own landscaping company. It was terrible and wonderful at the same time. I didn't know if anyone would want to work with me. A young woman in a field dominated by older men, accustomed to settling everything among themselves. But I told myself I had nothing to lose. The first year was a real trial. I barely had enough money for gas and tools. I did everything myself: designed flyers, kept the books, hauled bags of soil, laid tiles. My hands were covered in constant cuts and calluses. I got up at 5 in the morning and worked until dark, without days off, without a break. There were nights when I lay down on the couch, feeling my muscles ache with fatigue, and whispered into the darkness, what if I was wrong? But then things started to change. The first clients were satisfied and began recommending me to their friends and neighbors. Word of mouth, that's the real gold in our business. I didn't offer the cheapest solutions, but I did quality work, listened to what people wanted, and turned their dreams into living green spaces. Gradually, I felt it. My efforts were beginning to bear fruit, literally and figuratively. By the time I was 28, my business was on its feet. For the first time in my adult life, I felt stability. I could afford to hire a part-time assistant, pay bills without fear of having to close up shop tomorrow. It was then that I first thought about a house. I had rented a tiny apartment since my college days, and the walls of that dwelling had begun to feel like a cramped cage. I wanted my own place, where I could plant, replant, change layouts, where every bush and stone would be placed as I decided. I spent months looking at houses. Almost all the options I liked were too expensive. Real estate prices had gone crazy, and despite my success, I was still just the owner of a small business. I was beginning to lose hope when I found it. A house on the outskirts of the city, modest but with a huge backyard. The house needed repairs, peeling paint, crooked steps, a leaky roof. But the foundation was solid, and most importantly, the land. I felt its potential the moment I looked at the weed-filled plot. The previous owners had long since given up on this garden. Weeds had choked out the flowers, bushes stood dead, the lawn had turned into a parched patch of dirt. But I could already see what it could become. I dreamed of alleys of lavender, juniper hedges, a wrought iron bench under an apple tree. Yes, the mortgage payments promised to be unfavorable, but my heart insisted. this is my chance. I made an offer and lived on pins and needles for 3 days. I checked my mail every morning, my phone every few hours, and then they called. Their voice was calm, official, but the words were like a flash of light. Your offer has been accepted. I didn't believe it until I heard the dial tone, and then I screamed. I jumped around the room, tripped over boxes, laughed and cried at the same time, like a child who had been given the whole world, a piece of land where everything could start anew. I remember the day of the move down to the smallest detail. The air seemed thicker than usual. The sun shone not just brightly, but with a special warmth, as if it itself wished me luck. The truck with my boxes stood by the roadside, creaking with fatigue, and I stood in the middle of the yard, unable to believe it was all really happening. Before me was the house. Nothing special, just 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a tiny kitchen that seemed forever stuck in the 80s. Peeling cabinets, rusty handles, faded linoleum. But it was mine. Well, mine and the bank's, of course. But that's a small thing. For the first time in my life, I was holding the keys to my own house. Without unpacking, I went out into the backyard. The soil was parched, weeds stretched up to my knees, trees stood like forgotten sentinels, and yet I saw the outlines of the future in this chaos. From that day on, my new obsession began. I spent every free minute in the garden, pulling weeds, loosening the soil, laying paths with old bricks. After a long day with clients, I would come home and pick up a shovel. I worked until the darkness grew so thick I could no longer distinguish the outlines of the flowers. I fell asleep with the feeling that the earth under my nails was a sign of life, not dirt, but a symbol of labor and freedom. 2 years passed, and the transformation was almost a miracle. Where once there lay a dreary, dead patch of land, flower beds now swayed, herb beds fragrant, a tiny pond with goldfish murmured. I created several sections, a vegetable garden on the east side, a flower garden with plants chosen so that blooms would succeed one another all season long, and a cozy seating area in the shade of an old maple tree. Every morning, coming out with a cup of coffee, I admired this living canvas and couldn't believe I had created it all with my own hands. One day, flipping through a gardening magazine, I noticed an ad for a contest for the best small garden design. I smiled. My garden was exactly that. Without thinking, I took several photos from different angles trying to capture the morning light on the petals, the mirror reflection in the pond. I sent the photos and immediately forgot about them. What were the chances of winning? I imagined professionals with impeccable portfolios, expensive materials, and whole teams of workers participating. 3 months passed, and one afternoon the phone rang. When I heard the words on the other end, it was as if I'd had the wind knocked out of me. I screamed, unable to contain my delight. My name was announced as the winner in the small landscape design category. The magazine wanted to publish an article about my garden and interview me. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding the receiver, and felt goosebumps run down my spine. My little garden, created from scratch, was now going to be seen by people all over the country. But even success didn't knock me off my main path. My goal was simple: to pay off the mortgage as quickly as possible. Every extra dollar went to the bank. I didn't go on vacation, didn't spend money on clothes if the old ones were still holding up. All I had was an old truck that seemed to creak with fatigue, just like me. Friends would twirl their fingers at their temples, not understanding why I lived so modestly if business was going so well. But I had a plan. I worked 60 hours a week, took on any side job just to bring closer the day when the house would be completely mine. Sometimes I felt like I was missing out on life. I saw friends posting pictures from the sea, buying new cars, outfits, celebrating successes, and I was still with the same old gloves, the same coffee in a thermos, the same noodle dinners. There were evenings when loneliness hid in the corners of the rooms, and it seemed all my efforts were just running in circles. But as soon as I went out into the garden, walked between the blooming flower beds, inhaled the scent of roses and lavender, the anxiety would retreat. Everything around me reminded me why I had started this path. It wasn't just land, it was my life, embodied in every sprout, my future, my protection from anything that might happen. Now, at 34, I could finally say, the house belongs to me, without buts, without almost. No bank had any claim on it anymore. This feeling is indescribable, as if a stone that had been pressing on my chest all these years had finally fallen into the grass. I stood by the window looking at the garden, and for the first time in a long while, allowed myself to simply smile for no reason. I knew I had to celebrate this with my family. My brother Marcus was 3 years older. He had been married to Sarah for 10 years, and they had 2 boys, Lorenzo, 11, and Mattia, 7. They lived in a cramped rented apartment where the walls seemed to get closer every day, and I often helped them, sometimes paying the rent, sometimes just slipping the money for groceries. On rare weekends, they would come to visit me. Lorenzo and Mattia adored my garden. They chased each other along the paths, staged ship battles by the pond, fought with sticks like knights. To be honest, they weren't much help, but the children's laughter filled the plot with a special sound that made the silence seem kinder. Sarah, as always, stood aside, watching, and then would start. "It must be wonderful to have so much space," she would say, thoughtfully looking around the living room. "The boys could use a yard like this." I would smile politely and change the subject, but her words invariably left a mark, a subtle prick somewhere under my ribs. A week after I made the final mortgage payment, a feeling of weightlessness settled inside me, as if an entire era had ended, and I could finally exhale for the first time in a long time. I bought an expensive chocolate cake, the kind you usually get for special occasions, and a bottle of good wine. I wanted to share this moment not alone, but with those who had been there my whole life. Saturday evening was perfect. My parents always had Marcus and his family over for dinner. It seemed right to announce the news then, to tell everyone at once. When I entered my parents' house, the familiar noise was already there. In the living room, a flickering screen was reflected in my nephews' faces. Lorenzo and Mattia sat on the floor, eagerly pressing gamepad buttons. I put the cake and wine on the table, and impatience boiled inside me. I wanted to tell them, to share this liberation, this happiness. Mom noticed the box and squinted. "What's the occasion?" I smiled, feeling my heart pounding in my temples. "I have a surprise for everyone," I said solemnly. Mom waved me off. "Let's eat dinner first." We sat down at the table. The house smelled of roasted meat and coriander, as always on Saturdays. Sarah, as usual, didn't miss an opportunity to complain. She talked about the increased rent, how cramped their apartment was, that the upstairs neighbor was playing music at night again. My parents listened with sympathetic nods, agreeing as if confirming her every word. I sat and waited for the right moment, trying not to interrupt her stream of complaints. Finally, the conversation died down, and gathering my courage, I said, "I want to tell you something. This week I paid off the mortgage completely. The house is mine now, entirely mine." I said it with a smile, but in response, a strange, deafening silence fell over the table. Only the electronic sounds of the game from the living room could be heard, like distant flashes of another reality. No one said a word. Time seemed to freeze. Mom was the first to break the silence. "Oh, well, that's very nice, dear," she said in a flat, colorless voice, the kind used to read news copy. Marcus snorted without looking up from his plate. Sarah, on the contrary, froze, and then her face began to change. Surprise, bewilderment, irritation, a fake smile, and then anger again. "Well, congratulations," she finally said, but her voice rang with cold resentment. "Although, to be honest, it's not fair. You don't have a husband, you don't have children, you just got lucky, that's all. While we have to live in a cramped rented apartment with 2 children, you own a whole house." I clenched my hands under the table, trying not to raise my voice. "I didn't get lucky, Sarah. I worked. Without days off, without rest, for 9 years. I gave up everything for this house." But before I could finish, Sarah threw her fork and it clattered against the plate, as if splitting the room in half. Your family is us, Ambra. That means the house is family property. Marcus and I have a right to it. The words hit like a slap. I didn't even understand what I was hearing at first. This is my personal property, I said slowly. No one else has any claim to it. But Sarah was already wound up, her eyes shining with deliberate tears. She turned to Marcus, whining plaintively. Your sister is just selfish. We have to think about the children. Lorenzo and Mattia need space and a yard. They need to grow up in a proper house, not a cage. Marcus looked up and, to my horror, nodded. She's right, Ambra. I looked at my parents, expecting them to stop this nonsense, to say at least one word in my defense. But my father said calmly, as if discussing something obvious, Sarah is right, dear. They really do need it more. They have a family, children. Mom also nodded, with a soft smile, as if supporting an obvious solution. Think of the boys, she said. I laughed, not believing this was really happening. And where, in your opinion, should I live? I asked, feeling the laughter trembling on the verge of hysteria. Sarah didn't blink. Well, we could move into your house, and you could rent an apartment or something for now. Marcus chimed in. You earn well, Ambra. You could buy another house quickly, and in the meantime, we'll live at your place. And then something strange happened. The whole room, as if conspiring, started buzzing without me. They started talking among themselves, as if I had evaporated. First, Marcus started talking about how great it would be to have their own yard. Mom picked up enthusiastically. Lorenzo could have that big room by the window, and Mattia could be next door so he doesn't get lonely. Sarah, now animated, described how wonderfully she would arrange the kitchen, so we can finally cook properly. Father thoughtfully talked about how good the garden would be for the children, how it would help them grow closer to nature. I sat, unable to move. They were dividing my house, my labor, my years, my sweat and loneliness, as if I no longer existed, as if I had died, and they were reading the will, distributing the assets. Every word of theirs struck my heart, everything I had built, all the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, every centimeter of that garden, suddenly became the subject of their discussion, as if it were just a thing, property, not my life. And in that moment, I understood. Family is capable of much stranger invasions than any strangers. I couldn't bear another second of this madness. A dull wave of rage exploded in my chest. I slammed my palm on the table so hard the plates jumped and the wine in the glasses trembled. I am not giving my house to anyone. The words escaped before I could think them through. I stood up, the chair scraping unpleasantly as it moved back, as if it wanted to escape the tension in the air. This is my property, my labor, my life. I worked for this house, for this land, for myself, and it has nothing to do with any of you. Everyone stared at me in silence, as if at a madwoman, as if I had committed a monstrous crime by not agreeing to give them everything I had lived for the past 9 years. Their gazes were equally cold, a mix of condemnation and incomprehension. I grabbed my purse, the bottle of wine I'd brought as a symbol of celebration, and sharply exhaled, I don't believe you. Ambra, sit down, my father said sternly. His voice was dry, authoritarian, like in childhood when he tried to make Marcus and me obey without question. We just want to do what's best for the family. For the family? I repeated, feeling a new wave of anger boiling inside me. What about what's best for me? Did you ever think about how many nights I didn't sleep to pay off this house? That I gave up rest, a life, everything that makes a person happy? Sarah continued to sob, but the tears sounded deliberate. Think of Lorenzo and Mattia. They're your nephews. I turned to her and said quietly but tensely, I thought about them for 3 years when I paid your rent. Do you think that wasn't enough? I walked to the door without looking back, but the voices still sounded behind me. She'll come to her senses, Mom said, as if I were a child who needed to sleep off the emotions. She just needs time to think. "This house would really suit us perfectly," Sarah added. And then, as if by magic, her crying stopped. I slammed the door so hard the dishes on the shelf rattled. I stepped out into the cold evening. The air smelled of smoke and something metallic. When I got into the car, my hands were shaking with anger and disbelief. I couldn't believe what had just happened. These people, my family, those I had helped, whom I loved, had just tried to take my house from me. My house, my fortress, my reward for years of labor. They had turned the happiest day of my life into a disgusting nightmare. The drive home passed as if in a fog. I drove along familiar streets and saw nothing but my own thoughts, as if there was no world outside the window. Their voices echoed in my head again and again. They need it more. You earn well. You should think about the family. How? How could they? How could my parents, who saw me working from dawn till dusk, so easily take Marcus and Sarah's side? And how could my brother, the one I had helped out of debt more than once, sit there and nod, agreeing with this absurd idea? When I got home, the phone was already vibrating in my bag. Several calls in a row, then more. On the display, Mom, Father, Marcus, Sarah, in turn. I didn't answer any. The wine I had brought remained untouched on the kitchen table, now a symbol of something lost. A couple of hours later, messages came. First from Mom. "Ambra, you're being very selfish. Family is the most important thing. Call me back." Then Father. "Your mother is upset. You need to apologize and do the right thing." Then Marcus. "Stop acting like a child. We need to discuss this calmly." And finally, from Sarah. "I can't believe you're putting your own desires above the needs of your nephews. Aren't you ashamed?" I sat on the bed reading these lines, feeling something icy growing inside me. Everything I had done for them was now being used against me. I didn't reply to any. I deleted all the messages. I thought that if I just stayed quiet, in a couple of days, they would realize how ridiculous all this was and apologize. But I was wrong. A week passed, then a second. The phone continued to vibrate as if living its own life. Every call, every notification caused not anxiety, but irritation. Their persistence was turning into harassment. And yet, for the first time in many years, the weekends were quiet. Sarah didn't bring Lorenzo and Mattia over. No shrieks, no scattered toys, no dirty footprints on the floor. The house breathed. I woke up without calls, had breakfast in silence, watered the flowers, listened to the wind rustling the leaves. And for the first time in many months, I felt relief. But peace, as always, doesn't like to last long. On Tuesday, as I was sitting in the office reviewing estimates for new clients, my secretary knocked on the door. "Ambra, your mother is here to see you." My heart tightened. Of course. I should have guessed she wouldn't give up. "Let her in," I exhaled. Mom entered as if on a friendly visit, with a soft smile, with that expression she put on when she needed to get something. Her perfume filled the room with a light, sweetish scent, and I felt the irritation rising again. She sat down in the chair opposite my desk, folding her hands on her knees as if preparing for confession. "I wanted to talk to you about the house situation," she began in her deliberately soft tone. "I think you were a bit hasty in your decision." I frowned. "Hasty? Mom, it's my house. I bought it. I paid every last cent for it. I live in it. There's nothing to decide here. But Ambra, think of Marcus and Sarah." Mom began softly, lowering her eyes as if ashamed to utter these words, though each one was carefully rehearsed. "They really do need it. You've achieved great success in your business." She gestured around my office, as if emphasizing every detail. The glass desk, neat stacks of papers, the large windows through which the morning light streamed. "Look at all this, dear. You could easily afford to buy another house." I froze, not believing what I was hearing. For a second, I couldn't even answer. The very suggestion seemed too absurd. Then the words escaped my lips more sharply than I intended. "Mom, do you have any idea what I went through to have all this? I haven't had a vacation in 9 years. I drove a rusty truck that kept breaking down. I wore clothes that belonged in a thrift store. I ate instant noodles to pay the loan. Every month, down to the last penny. This isn't just a house. It's my labor, my life, my only reward for everything I've been through. I know, dear." Mom sighed, and her voice held a false pity. "But you're in a better position than Marcus and Sarah. They have to think about the children. They have a family. They have responsibility." She said the last word with such emphasis, as if wanting to stamp out all my arguments with it. "And what about me, Mom?" My voice became quiet, but all the firmer for it. "What about what I want? What about the fact that I love my house and my garden, where I planted every tree with my own hands? Or maybe I'm supposed to live in a box because I don't have children?" Mom's face froze. It took on that expression of stubbornness I remembered from childhood. When she looked like that, arguing was pointless. "Ambra," she said with emphasis, "you are selfish. Family must help family. You have to be generous since you've achieved so much." The word selfish sounded from her lips like a verdict. It seemed to stick to the air and hang over us like a shadow. That was the word they all loved to use as a weapon. It contained everything: accusation, pressure, humiliation, the desire to protect what was mine, what belonged to me by right, suddenly became a sin. "Mom," I said wearily, getting up from the desk, "I need you to leave." I walked to the door and opened it. "And you know what? You should be ashamed. Ashamed that you so openly play favorites with your children." Mom jumped up, clutching her purse as if ready to hit someone with it. Her cheeks flushed red. "You are making a big mistake, young lady," she hissed through her teeth. "This family will not forget how you've behaved." "Good," I replied quietly, almost with relief. "Maybe then you'll finally leave me alone." She rushed out of the office and her heels clicked down the corridor like an angry metronome, beating the rhythm of the old family madness. A week passed. Everything seemed to have calmed down. But soon my phone started ringing off the hook again. People I had barely been in touch with for years were calling. Aunt Carol, who lived 2 states away, my cousin Mike, whom I hadn't seen in 5 years, even old great-uncle Henry, the one who only showed up at weddings and funerals. "Ambra, dear," Aunt Carol drawled in her soft, oily voice, "your mother called me. She's very worried about you. She says you're not being very kind to your brother and his family." "Did she tell you they want me to give them my house?" I asked calmly. Silence hung. I could almost hear Aunt Carol pursing her lips on the other end. "Well, she mentioned they're having a hard time right now, that the children need more space." "Aunt Carol," I squinted, looking out the window at my garden where the autumn wind stirred the leaves. "Tell me, would you give your house to someone just because they need it more?" Another pause, long and awkward. "Well, that's different," she finally muttered. "It's a completely different situation." "How is it different?" I asked. There was no answer, only short beeps. Aunt Carol had hung up. The same thing happened with the others. Cousin Mike hung up as soon as I asked the same question. Uncle Henry mumbled something incoherent about having to go and hastily ended the conversation. It was obvious. Mom had called everyone she could, spreading her version of events, where I played the role of a monstrous, callous, rich sister who refused to help her poor relatives. She skillfully played on their emotions, like an old piano, pressing the right keys: pity, guilt, duty. The manipulation was perfected. Another 2 weeks passed. The calls stopped. I began to hope the storm had exhausted itself. The air around felt cleaner, the house filled again with its familiar peace. I was working with pleasure again, getting up early, listening to the morning sun flooding the kitchen with soft light. It seemed everything had finally returned to normal. But on that Saturday morning, I woke up to the roar of engines and loud voices outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought a neighbor was moving. But the noise didn't subside. On the contrary, it got closer. The voices became clearer. I threw on a robe and went out onto the porch, and froze. In my driveway stood a huge moving truck with a logistics company's logo. 2 workers in gray overalls were already unloading furniture and boxes, unhurriedly, as if on schedule, and in the middle of the yard, Sarah, in her elegant coat with her manicured hands pointing towards my house as if it were her private property. "Put the sofa in the living room," she commanded, "and be careful with those boxes. They have the children's toys." Marcus stood nearby, arms crossed, with the air of someone who found this all perfectly natural. Next to him stood Lorenzo and Mattia, confused, frightened, clinging to his coat. I looked at them and couldn't believe this was happening in real life. I walked up to Sarah, feeling my heart pounding so hard the thumping seemed to echo in my ears. Anger burned inside, turning the air between us into crackling electricity. "What the hell is going on here?" I asked, trying not to shout, but my voice cracked into a scream anyway. Sarah turned to me with an expression of feigned surprise, not a drop of sincerity in it. "Oh, Ambra," she drawled with pretended gentleness. "We're moving in. I hope you don't mind we started a bit early." "Moving in?" I almost choked on my rage. "Have you completely lost your minds?" Marcus came out from behind the car, his face calm, almost condescending. He always tried to look reasonable when he knew he was acting meanly. "Ambra, don't make a scene," he said, as if speaking to a child. "We've already discussed this. Let us bring the things in, and then we can discuss the details calmly." "We haven't discussed anything," I cut him off. "I said no clearly. This is my house. Mine, not yours, not Mom's, not Dad's, and certainly not Sarah's." Sarah came closer. A special glint flashed in her eyes, cold, calculating, manipulative. "Ambra," she said with a sad intonation that even a child wouldn't believe, "we terminated our lease. We have nowhere else to go." And without letting me answer, she called out loudly, "Lorenzo, Mattia, come here quickly." The children approached, embarrassed, heads lowered. Sarah theatrically put her hands on their shoulders. "You wouldn't dare throw your own nephews out on the street, would you?" she said with deliberate tragedy, like an actress in a bad play. I looked at the boys, confused, silent, then back at Sarah. A smug smile played on her lips. She was clearly sure she had trapped me. But she made a mistake. A crude, fatal mistake. She thought my compassion could be used against me. I turned to the movers and said loudly so each of them could hear, "Gentlemen, you are on private property without the owner's permission. This is illegal trespassing. If you do not leave immediately, I will call the police." The men froze. One of them, young, with a tired face, glanced at Marcus. "Hey, man," he said, "you said this was your sister's house and she was cool with it. Is she really cool with it?" Marcus flushed. "Ambra, stop being dramatic," he hissed through his teeth. "I am not cool with it," I shouted. "This is my house and you all have no right to be here." The movers exchanged glances. Obviously, such family dramas weren't new to them. One shrugged, the other nodded, and without a word they started reloading the furniture into the truck. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking into a shriek. "Don't you dare! Don't listen to her! We paid you! You have to deliver our things!" But the movers weren't idiots. They knew when to get out. Within minutes, everything they had unloaded was back in the truck. Sarah, red with anger, rushed around the yard, shouting insults. "You're selfish, Ambra, a ruthless, heartless woman!" she screamed. Marcus came closer to me, trying to grab my arm. "Ambra, be reasonable," he said, lowering his voice. "We're your family." "Get out," I replied coldly, pulling my arm away. "Off my property, right now." But Sarah wasn't about to give up. She headed for the house and with unexpected fury started kicking my front door. "It's not fair," she screamed. "You know we have no other place." I took out my phone. "You have 30 seconds to leave," I said calmly without shouting, "or I call the police." Those words finally pierced their blind certainty. Marcus grabbed Sarah by the arm, almost forcibly dragging her to the car. She kept screaming now from behind his back, but he, without looking back, put the children in and closed the doors. The truck started, its wheels screeching on the gravel, and a minute later all that remained was a trail of dust on the road. I stood in the middle of the yard, listening to the wind rustle the leaves, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Then the phone rang. Mom flashed on the screen. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, voicemails started pouring in one after another, angry, accusatory, with the same words I'd heard all my life. You should be ashamed. Family above all. You've broken everyone's heart. I deleted each one without listening to the end. In the evening, a message came from Marcus. Cold, short. You owe us money for a new apartment. Because of you, we have nowhere to live. I laughed, loudly, almost hysterically. Tears welled up in my eyes, but from laughter, not pain. From today, I will not help you with anything, I wrote. Not a cent. Sort it out yourselves. And without waiting for a reply, I blocked the number. After that, 2 weeks of silence followed. For the first time in a long while, my house was filled with calm. I was working on a big landscaping project for a new shopping center, came home late, enjoyed the evening on the porch, listening to the crickets chirp. Everything was mine again, my space, my labor, my peace. But one day, returning home from work, I saw something that made my heart stop. My garden, my wonderful, blooming, living garden, had been destroyed. The earth was dug up, plants torn out by the roots lay in the dirt like dead bodies. The flowers I had lovingly grown were trampled. The stone paths were overturned, the lantern by the pond was smashed. Everything I had built over the years had turned into chaos and ashes. I stood amidst the devastation, feeling anger and despair burning my throat. It felt as if someone had torn out a piece of my soul and thrown it at my feet. Years of labor, sleepless nights, hopes, all gone to waste. I had no doubt who could have committed this barbarity, but I needed proof. Anger boiled inside me, but along with it grew a cold determination. Not a flash of emotion, but an icy certainty that now everything would be done by the law. I rushed to my laptop, feeling my fingers tremble as I typed the password. A few years ago, after a series of nighttime break-ins in our neighborhood, I had installed surveillance cameras around the perimeter of the property. No one in the family knew about it. I thought the less they knew about my private life, the more peaceful my life would be. I opened the recordings from the day of the destruction. My heart raced as the screen came to life. On the video, clearly in daylight, were they, Marcus and Sarah. I saw them laughing, tearing out lavender bushes by the roots, breaking jasmine branches, overturning pots, trampling flower beds. Sarah was even laughing as she pulled out my roses, the very ones that had won awards at city exhibitions for several years running. Their faces, distorted with malicious glee, were too clear to allow for the slightest doubt. I transferred the recording to my phone, closed the laptop, and without a second thought, drove to my parents' house. No calls, no warnings. I wasn't going to give them a chance to prepare for the meeting or invent excuses. When I entered, the whole family was gathered in the living room. Parents, Marcus, Sarah, and the children. All of them, cozily settled around the dinner table, looked as if this evening were the most ordinary one. Mom was the first to look up, her face showing mild surprise. "Ambra, what are you doing here?" she asked, but her voice held not so much worry as irritation at the unexpected visit. Sarah, meanwhile, smirked almost imperceptibly. She was enjoying my anger, anticipating how she would turn it all into a spectacle about the poor innocent woman suffering from a cold sister. "Someone destroyed my garden today," I said evenly, almost without emotion, feeling an avalanche of rage hidden behind the calm. Sarah shrugged, feigning surprise. "How awful," she said with feigned regret. "There are so many troublemakers these days, aren't there?" "Yes," I nodded. "That's exactly why I'm going to the police, especially since I have it all on video." Silence engulfed the room. I raised my phone and played the recording. On the screen, Sarah laughing over my flowers and Marcus tearing out bushes with manic diligence. Everything was perfectly clear, not a single frame left room for invention. The color drained from their faces. "I'm going to sue both of you," I said quietly, but there was more strength in my voice than in any shout. and I will post this video online so everyone can see what you're really like." Mom gasped. "Ambra, please don't do that. Don't do this to family," she pleaded, looking at me as if I were the one destroying the family, not those who had literally destroyed my labor. "Not do what, Mom?" I asked. "Not seek justice? Not show the truth about what they did?" Marcus finally found his voice. "Ambra, let's settle this calmly. Without the police," he said, trying to sound confident. But his eyes darted like a cornered animal. "You have 1 week," I said, "to transfer $3,000 to me for damages. If you don't, I will file a report and post the recording everywhere I can. Everyone will find out what you did." "$3,000?" Sarah gasped. "We don't have that kind of money." "Then find it," I replied coldly. "You had enough money to break your lease and hire movers. Figure it out yourselves." I turned and walked out without looking back. I had nothing more to say to them. Exactly 7 days later, a bank transfer notification arrived, $3,000 from Marcus, followed by a short message, "We never want to see you again." I laughed. The laugh was dry, almost joyless, but genuine nonetheless, as if I were laughing not at them, but at the sheer absurdity of their malicious scheming. Several months passed. I restored the garden, not just restored it, but turned it into a living work of art. New plants took root, I laid the paths anew, added lighting, and now in the evenings my plot glowed with a soft light, as if from the breath of the earth itself. My business flourished, orders kept increasing. I finally allowed myself to rest without guilt, knowing that every meter of my world belonged only to me. From mutual acquaintances, I learned that Marcus and his family had moved in with our parents. The house that once held comfort had now turned into a cramped cage. 6 people, 3 rooms, constant quarrels and complaints. Mom was tired, Dad was irritated, Sarah was driving everyone crazy with her control and whining, and Marcus, they said, would sit in the car for hours just to avoid going home. And yet, it didn't touch me anymore. Not a shadow of schadenfreude, no burning satisfaction, only a deep, quiet indifference. Sometimes in the evening, I sit in my garden, watch the sun slowly sink below the horizon, listen to the birds singing somewhere in the foliage, and I think, how would things have turned out if they could have just been happy for me, if their hearts had room for something other than envy? But then I realize I'm better off without them. Better to be alone in a house filled with light, silence, and the scent of roses than among those who see in me only a wallet and a source of benefits for others. And in that thought, strangely, there is more peace than in any forgiven grievance.